It's no secret that, in the early years of the space race, the Soviet Union held the lead. They were the first to send a satellite into orbit, then a living creature, and then a human being. They even went so far as to be the first to perform a spacewalk when Alexei Leonov stepped out of the Voskhod spacecraft and floated free in the vacuum of space. Their leadership began to wane after that point, and even the details of those first achievements are a little murky, something I've discussed at length already, but it's true that humanity's excellence in space was kicked off by the actions of the Soviet Union. Behind it all, at every turn, every major achievement had one man at the helm. One enigmatic figure was always present, the architect of the space program, making it all possible. In the West, he was known only as Glavny Konstruktor, or Chief Designer. His identity was kept largely secret up until his death to protect him from possible Cold War assassination attempts, with it going so far that some cosmonauts didn't even know his last name when they shook his hand before going into space. He was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, and today we're going to tell his story. Two things I want to take note of before we begin. One, I apologize in advance for a lack of relevant footage or images related to some of the things we're going to talk about. The Soviets very famously did not do a good job of documenting their early space program, and this becomes worse with aspects of it they wanted to keep secret. Second, a lot of Soviet history is shrouded in unproven rumor. However, I will do my best to only tell the truth, and if something I say does seem a little dodgy, I'll both try to stress its unproven nature and welcome corrections. Friendly corrections, as always. Korolev was born on December 30th, 1906 in the city of Zhytomyr in present-day Ukraine before his family moved to Kiev in the next year. His mother, Maria, was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, though there's little on record about his father, Pavel, outside of him being a teacher of the Russian language. Pavel and Maria separated when Sergei was only 3 due to financial difficulties, and his father wrote a letter requesting to visit his son, but Sergei was allegedly told that his father had passed away. By 1929, this became true, and Sergei would never come to know his biological father. He grew up through his childhood largely by his maternal grandparents, as his mother was often away taking higher education courses. A lonely child, Sergei grew into a stubborn and argumentative boy, though his teachers would note he had particularly proficient reading and mathematics skills. When his mother remarried in 1916, his new stepfather, Grigory, became a very positive influence on him, encouraging to improve his manners and develop good study habits. Sergei's family moved to Odessa in 1917, a difficult time to live in what was transitioning from the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. This was a time of upheaval, and life for the everyday citizen was very difficult. From 1721 up until this point, Russia had been an empire ruled by a monarchy, and leading up to its end, experienced significant poverty, food shortages, and inequality. World War I only made the situation more desperate, leaving millions of Russians dead and a complete economic collapse. In 1905, amid rising protests and tensions, Tsar Nicholas II would create a Duma, a kind of weak parliament, though it held little power and did nothing to assuage the people. In February 1917, a widespread revolt took place, but failed, leading to an increased crackdown from the Duma, the abdication of Nicholas II from the throne, and a period of time where the Marxist Bolshevik Party began gaining support under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin. The October Revolution in the same year, again under Lenin's leadership, seized major power centers, collapsing the provisional government, and the Soviet Union was officially formed in 1922. During the revolution, many schools were closed, and Sergei Korolev was forced to continue much of his studies from home. He also suffered a bout of typhus during this time of severe food shortages, something that may have contributed to the lasting health issues that he struggled with throughout the rest of his life. By 1922, the city was still recovering from the Civil War, but Korolev was ready to take the next steps in his life. The teenage Sergei passed qualifying exams for a senior year at the Odessa Professional Construction School, equivalent to a Western community college. Here he would meet his future wife, Ksenia Vincenti, but by now he already had his sights set on career goals. At age 6, he had witnessed an air show and became fascinated with planes and aeronautical engineering. This would manifest in 1923 when, in the midst of applying for further education, he joined the newly formed Friends of Air Fleet Society, where he would have his first flying lessons. By 1924, he would begin studies at the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, but then transferred to Bauman High Technical School in Moscow 2 years later, where he would design his first glider, the K-5, at just 17 years old. In 1929, Korolev graduated from the High Technical School and joined the Central Aero and Hydrodynamics Institute, a Russian aviation institute, in 1931. In the same year, Russia founded one of its first state-sponsored institutes for the study and advancement of rocketry, GERD, sometimes referred to as the Jet Propulsion Research Group. Don't ask, this thing has like 5 different names and none of them translate to an appropriate acronym for GERD. I don't know. Either way, a year after its founding, the institute caught Korolev's eye. At the time, he was working as a lead engineer on the Tupolev TB-3 heavy bomber, and he became interested in the idea of using liquid-fueled rocket engines to propel airplanes. This led him to make contact with GERD's founder, Friedrich Sander, sparking an interest in rocketry and space exploration. In 1932, as Sander's health began to wane, Korolev was appointed as the head of GERD, and the institute was divided into 4 divisions. Sander would remain in charge of rocket engines, 2 other divisions would develop short-range missiles and jet engines, and Korolev would lead the 4th division in the development of rocket planes and cruise missiles. When Sander passed away unexpectedly in the next year, GERD was reorganized, combined with another institute, and renamed the Reactive Scientific Research Institute, or RNII. Korolev worked with the group on a manned rocket-powered glider, as well as on Vehicle 09, the first liquid-fueled rocket to be launched from Russia. 09 was developed largely by the 2nd Division, led by Mikhail Tikhonravov, and was something of a hybrid rocket. Having suffered problems with Vehicle 07, Mikhail's team mixed its liquid oxidizer with a gasoline turned into a jelly-like substance, which they named solid benzene. While this fuel would not last very long in rocket history, it would work for Vehicle 09, allowing the engineers to go from paper to the launch pad for the first time. Over a period of 2.5 months, the team would perform 22 or 23 static tests of 09 without launching it, trying to resolve fuel injection, freezing valves, and liquid oxygen flow problems, rehauling the design over and over and over again. Finally, on August 11, 1933, the rocket was ready for a first test flight under the direction of Korolev and several others. The rocket was carefully prepared, the combustion chamber filled with gasoline, and the oxidizer tank filled with liquid oxygen. Korolev lit the fuse for the delayed parachute deployment, and everyone watched as the rocket remained on the pad until the parachute release fired, ejecting the fairing without the ignition ever occurring. The problem was found quickly. The spark plug that would begin the ignition process had failed, and was replaced for a second attempt 2 days later. The August 13th launch was met with cold and rain, though Korolev invited a military department chief to attend, hoping to garner further support for the rocket program. This time the engine did ignite, but the rocket didn't take off. The pressure of the liquid oxygen tank was only 1/5 of what it needed to be, and the flames simply raged on the concrete pad until the propellant was burnt out. Korolev had to cannibalize parts from a backup rocket to repair the aft fairing and stabilizers, and explained to the rocket team's leaders that they needed to acquire a pressure sensor, something they hadn't had access to. If they had one, they could pinpoint the moment where the oxygen pressure was ideal for ignition. With only a few people observing this time, the rocket was readied for a 3rd attempt on August 17th. The tanks reached 13.5 psi, 3.5 pounds below the maximum level. At the same time, a stream of vapor revealed that a safety valve was leaking, preventing further pressurization. A quick discussion resulted in a decision to launch anyway, since it wouldn't prevent a liftoff, but merely an inability to reach its maximum altitude. With the desire to finally have a successful launch of some degree, Korolev lit the parachute fuse cord. The ignition activated and the oxygen supply began to flow, bringing with it a loud bang and the startup sound of the engine. The rocket ascended slowly, hovered at the tip of the launch stand, then promptly shot into the air. Beginning a long and sad Soviet space tradition, an excited machinist doubling as a photographer would fail to capture the rocket's ascent, instead photographing the empty woods. The team ran out of the blockhouse to watch as the rocket first flew vertically, then wobbled, turned over, and began a steep fall where it plunged into the nearby woods. It broke apart as it struck the ground, but the team found it with smoke still leaving the engine nozzle. Soviet rocketry had officially begun. Korolev's role in RNII waxed and waned for a little while. In 1934, after a disagreement in the agency's direction, he was demoted to a section chief, supervising development of cruise missiles and rocket-powered gliders. In 1935, his daughter Natalia was born, and the new family moved into their own apartment in 1936. The rise of Lenin and the birth of the Soviet Union was not the last of the hard times the average citizen living in this part of the world would face. When Lenin died in 1924, a power struggle ended with leadership being taken by Joseph Stalin. In 1936, after the assassination of a prominent Bolshevik revolutionary, Stalin began the Great Purge. For the next 2 years, the average person would live in terror of authorities deeming them to be not communist enough, or even the wrong brand of communist, and being thrown into a gulag or even outright murdered. At the height of these purges, they would find one such undeserved victim, Sergei Korolev. The RNII suffered greatly from the Great Purge, with its director and chief engineer both arrested, tortured, made to sign false confessions, and eventually executed in 1937. The next year, Valentin Glushko, who would eventually come to manage the entirety of the Soviet space program, and several other engineers were imprisoned, with Korolyov's arrest coming only a few months later. He faced a variety of charges, all stemming from false accusations made under duress by his co-workers, including Glushko and the two executed RNII members. He was initially sent to a concentration camp in Siberia, where he would briefly work in a gold mine, sustaining injuries that included a possible heart attack. He lost most of his teeth to scurvy caused by the camp's poor conditions of inadequate food and clothing, and would then be transferred in 1940 to the infamous Butyrka prison in Moscow. A notoriously overcrowded prison with poor living conditions deliberately designed to break its inmates, Korolev was thankfully transferred out again in the same year after being formally charged with phony allegations of sabotage. He was sentenced to 8 years in labor camps and was sent to a design bureau within the prison system that existed solely to exploit the high volume of inmates that the Purge had brought on. Led by fellow prisoner Andrei Tupolev, this bureau allowed Korolev to continue some manner of aerospace work, participating in the design of the Tu-2 bomber. He was then transferred again to a camp where he was now put under the charge of Valentin Glushko. The entire time throughout his imprisonment, Korolev wrote constant appeals to the authorities, even writing directly to Stalin himself. Whether or not someone heard these pleas is unclear, but he was eventually finally paroled in June of 1944, having served 6 of his 8-year sentence. The charges levied against him would stay with him until 1957. Korolev returned to his work with RNII for a time, studying various rocket designs under Glushko and speaking rarely of his time in the Gulag. He would eventually learn that Glushko had been one of his accusers, sparking a lifelong animosity between the two. In the next year, he was commissioned into the Red Army with the rank of colonel, which led to him being asked to travel to Germany for evaluation and restoration of recently recovered A-4 ballistic missiles. You may remember these better as the V-2, the world's first long-range guided liquid-fueled missile pioneered by Wernher von Braun. Unfortunately, when it came to salvaging the technology and brains of the rocket, the Americans won out, obtaining von Braun himself and most of his team via Operation Paperclip. The Soviets, in their own Operation Osavehim, acquired several German scientists and captured V-2 missiles themselves, but none of the scientists had worked directly with von Braun or his team. Thankfully for them, what they lacked in German brainpower, they made up for in Ukrainian brainpower. Korolev was appointed chief of a department for the newly created NII-88, or Scientific Research Institute No. 88, a rocket and spacecraft center that deals with all phases of development from conceptual designs all the way to flight tests. Korolev took on the role of chief designer of long-range missiles, a moniker that would follow him for the rest of his life. He appointed a council of chief designers who helped him in circumventing the red tape that surrounded the hierarchy of the Soviet missile industry, and this group would eventually take direct control over the entirety of the early space program. By 1947, Korolev was back from Germany, tasked with reproducing V-2 rockets from the handful of parts they had available. Unable to do so, they ended up designing and assembling a Soviet copy, designated R-1. Korolev wasn't a fan of this. He thought it would be more effective to use what they knew about the V-2 and build something better and original, which they would eventually do, but not before testing about a dozen V-2 rockets and 9 R-1 rockets. While Korolev was trying to get R-2 design and construction approved, even going so far as to meet directly with Stalin about it, he was at odds with a team of German scientists who had their own opposing proposal. Korolev objected to working with the Germans beyond the V-2, citing personal reasons likely related to World War II, ignoring their suggestions and advice and keeping any knowledge or access to Soviet designs hidden from them. The R-2 was approved for experimental work in 1948, and the German proposal was cancelled in 1950, the team dissolved and repatriated. The R-2 was a great success, the first rocket capable of separating its warhead from the rest of the rocket, and with double the range of the V-2. The next iteration, the R-3, was less successful, having lower thrust in its engine than was intended. It was cancelled in 1952, and Korolev officially joined the Soviet Communist Party to try and obtain funding for future projects. The eventual goal was to develop a missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, and their next rocket, the R-5, had this capability, able to carry an 80-kiloton warhead with an accuracy of within 1.5 kilometers. Now making serious progress, Korolev and his bureau quickly moved on to the true game-changer, the R-7 Semyorka, the world's first true intercontinental ballistic missile. By now, Korolev's section of NII-88 was separated from the rest of it, now named Experimental Design Bureau 1 or OKB-1. Needing to really up the ante with the R-7, Korolev returned to proposals he had seen much earlier, specifically the proposal from Mikhail Tikhonravov made in 1948 called a rocket packet. While a multi-stage rocket wasn't exactly a novel idea even back then, he proposed that rocket engines firing in parallel, or in a packet as he called it, could increase the range of said rocket. At the time, his proposal was met with ridicule, as there was a false belief that rockets had an absolute limit of 1,000 kilometers in range. Korolev, however, supported the proposal and suggested further studies of it. A department of applied mathematics related to OKB-1 refined the concept more, leading Korolev to the base design of a core stage with 4 strap-on boosters for the R-7. Glushko's department was responsible for the engines, doing a complete redesign of the existing RD-105 engines based on the previous R series of rockets. By combining 4 combustion chambers with a single turbopump, they were able to acquire an overall higher thrust than a similar single-chamber engine. This brought it within range of its end goal, being capable of carrying a single 6-ton thermonuclear warhead that could be sent 8,000 kilometers away with an accuracy of within 5 kilometers of its target. Furthermore, the new design reduced weight and introduced standardization, with all boosters in the core stage using more or less the same engine, with the core stage being a slightly uprated RD-107 instead of the 106 used on the boosters. Previous designs based on the engine of the V2 used jet vanes that would direct the nozzle exhaust for control. The R-7, however, introduced vernier thrusters, smaller engines mounted on the outer edges of both the boosters and the core stage that could tilt and control the rocket's direction. In 1957, Korolev and his team were severely disheartened when the first 3 test launches of the R-7 all ended in failure. It was a complicated and unprecedented beast, requiring never-before-done synchronization of multiple engine systems, stage separation, careful and precise timing and trajectories, and it was difficult to make that sequence come together all at once. Korolev was not only concerned that he would lose his position at OKB-1 due to all these failures, but that his eventual goal would become impossible. Korolev had long since considered the possibility of rockets to achieve spaceflight and launch artificial satellites, and the R-7 was the first vehicle that he knew of that would be capable of doing this. He shared these ideas with Mikhail Tikhonravov, and prior to the R-7 test launches, submitted a proposal to Soviet leadership to use the R-7 for artificial satellite launches, which received a lukewarm response. Nobody was eager to help him do it, but they weren't exactly shooting down the idea either. Alongside Tikhonravov, Korolev started a small research project in satellite development, writing articles on potential future spaceflight in Soviet newspapers to build support. Eventually, this would unintentionally spark the beginnings of the space race. When the United States began to read these articles, they suddenly remembered that their own rocket scientists, such as Wernher von Braun, had similar goals. In 1955, the Eisenhower administration announced their goal of launching small Earth-orbiting satellites into space, and Korolev was quick to suggest that the Soviets could beat them to the punch. They already had the vehicle to do it, and he proceeded to send new proposals that included details about what was known of the US space program to Soviet leadership. This time, much more attention was paid to him, and his proposal was approved. Several things began to happen all at once. The R-7 had just seen a successful test flight about a week prior to Korolev's plan being approved, delivering a dummy payload to the Kamchatka Peninsula. Korolev began to modify the design of the R-7 for satellite launches rather than nuclear payloads, while Tikhonravov took charge of designing the satellite itself. In April of 1957, the Soviet Union officially recognized Korolev as being, quote, rehabilitated from his previous charges, the government acknowledging that his sentence had been unjust, but not acknowledging that no crime had ever been committed in the first place. The satellite project quickly fell behind schedule. The original plan was very sophisticated, a small orbiting laboratory referred to as Object D. Much of it had very little precedent, entirely first of its kind, including pressurized equipment, automated switches, magnetometers, spectrometers, Geiger counters, meteorite counters, and sophisticated communications equipment. Korolev had finalized the R-7 modifications by mid-1956, but the satellite was still far from ready, and fears were growing that the Americans would end up launching first. Reports of the American Vanguard project had reached Soviet ears, though they were apparently unaware of how unreliable and explosive the Vanguard rocket was in its infancy. Further testing of the R-7 deemed it incapable of hefting Object D's significant mass, 1,327 kilograms or 2,936 pounds, into orbit, and Korolev made the decision to revise the plan. A new, much simpler and lighter satellite was designed and approved, nicknamed Object PS. It was constructed hastily, in less than a month, by Tikhonravov and his group, overseen by Korolev. The satellite was a simple beach ball-sized sphere with 4 whip-like antennas extending out from it and batteries and a transmitter inside. After a second successful test of the R-7, the space age began on October 4, 1957. Object PS-1 was launched successfully, dubbed Sputnik 1 for the public. A red moon was now circling the Earth, kicking off what would become known as the Sputnik Crisis, the period of public fear in the United States about the military potential of Soviet spaceflight, and all of it was due to a man who nobody in the US even knew the name of.
It's frightening. We should find out what they're doing that we're not doing, and we should do something about it very quickly.
Well, I think that, Russia's getting into space really bothers me because it's making the Cold War between the Russia and the United States, more intense.
While the Soviets initially did little to hype up the success of the launch, the massive international reaction made them reevaluate and pat their own backs a little harder. Korolev was encouraged to launch more complex payloads, beginning with Sputnik 2. Designed just as hastily as the first, this one had a pressurized environment to hold Laika, a mongrel dog taken off the streets of Moscow. Though the launch was a success, the vehicle's thermal controls failed in orbit, and Laika would die of heat exhaustion after 5 hours. Object D would finally come next, though its first launch failed, with the second succeeding and being dubbed Sputnik 3. Much like other rocketry pioneers, Korolev's eyes were always looking further than his projects were currently going. Well before Sputnik 1, he had been interested in using the R-7 to send something to the moon, possibly mirroring Robert Goddard's ideas of landing a payload there and igniting a packet of flash powder that could be observed from the Earth. In 1958, he wrote a letter detailing how the current technology was capable of going to the moon, and his plan was approved. The R-7 was modified with a new upper stage to extend how far it could take a payload, with new engines designed specifically to fire in the vacuum of space, a first of their kind. Korolev led the development of the new spacecraft intended to soft land on the moon and gave them a name, Mekta, meaning dream. This name gained notoriety later through Alexander Kazantsev, a Soviet science fiction author who was very vocal about hyping up the space program. However, publicly, the spacecraft and their carrier rocket went by another name, Luna, or Moon. The Lunar program was rushed by political pressure in its infancy, resulting in 3 consecutive failures. While Korolev wrestled with demands from Moscow, at one point he was being pressured to beat the US to a working lunar probe, and he allegedly exclaimed, quote, "Do you think that only American rockets explode?" While the lunar program was ongoing, Korolev branched out into numerous projects for the future, conceiving the Mars program, which made a successful flyby in 1963, though communications had failed and the probe was unable to return any data. He also worked out the early Venera missions and set his focus onto human spaceflight. The obvious next step in the space race, Korolev had drafted early designs for the Vostok spacecraft back in 1958. It was to hold a single occupant and be fully automated, with the pilot only taking control in the case of an emergency. He recruited Konstantin Feoktistov, who had worked on the Sputnik program and would later be trained as a cosmonaut for the Voskhod program, to work directly alongside him in the design of Vostok. The spacecraft was tested repeatedly, first empty, then with pairs of dogs, with mixed results. Eventually, once they began to successfully recover the dogs, they added a dummy cosmonaut nicknamed Ivan Ivanovich. By April 12, 1961, the Vostok program was ready for a true human flight, with Yuri Gagarin as the pilot. Korolev served as capsule communicator. However, here's a fun little fact. You may have seen this famous footage of Korolev issuing commands during the mission. However, there's a twist. This isn't real. The events of Vostok 1 weren't widely filmed, and this footage was recreated later for PR purposes. Some of the footage is real, such as the launch and some of the footage of Gagarin in the capsule, but abilities were limited, and some had to be staged after the fact to make the space program seem a little flashier to the average person. At this point, Korolev had begun to devise the Soyuz program, which was originally intended to be the beginning of Soviet crewed lunar flights. The first Soyuz flights would focus on the ability to rendezvous and dock in orbit, which was complex and required a lot of work and planning. However, Khrushchev was pushing Korolev and the Bureau to perform more firsts, and quickly, going so far as threatening to give the job to a rival bureau. Korolev proposed a compromise, the Voskhod program, a multi-crew spacecraft that could fly 3 cosmonauts at once, or 2 with the ability to perform a spacewalk, both firsts at the time. Korolev then used the leverage he had gained to push for more backing of his super heavy N-1 rocket for the lunar program. However, it is worth mentioning that some sources dispute the claim of the threats, stating that Khrushchev would not have ordered these more advanced missions without them being ready to go. Voskhod was prepared quickly to meet some interim goals for Khrushchev's sake while Soyuz was still being developed. For this reason, it required little extra development beyond Vostok, with the biggest aspect being a landing system. 3 people couldn't eject safely out of the craft the way a single person could, so some time was spent developing a larger parachute system. A few uncrewed test flights experienced failure with this until the material of the parachutes was strengthened and the vehicle was ready to fly. Outside of the landing system, Voskhod was very stripped down, removing as much as possible to save weight for a backup retrofire engine. Since it would be sent to higher orbits than Vostok was, it wouldn't naturally decay in a timely manner, so it needed to ensure the ability to deorbit in an emergency. Seating for 3 people also meant removing the ejection seats, even in the case of an emergency, meaning that if Voskhod were to experience a booster failure early in the launch, there was no way out. Voskhod 1 outdid the Americans again by performing the first multi-crew flight, sending 3 cosmonauts on a 16-orbit trip in October of 1964. After learning that the Americans were planning a spacewalk early in their Gemini program, the Soviets decided to outdo them yet again by attaching a detachable inflatable airlock to the craft, though the spacewalk nearly ended in disaster. I won't go into detail since that's mentioned extensively in the video I already plugged at the beginning of this video. Korolev began to divide his attention between the Soyuz, Luna, and N-1 programs. His plan to take Soviet cosmonauts to the moon was multi-layered, beginning with something he called the Soyuz ABC Circumlunar Complex, consisting of 2 vehicles launched individually then docked in Earth orbit, creating a complex enough vehicle to facilitate a lunar flyby. At the same time, this was competing with OKB-52, another bureau that was proposing its own series of spacecraft utilizing an undeveloped rocket that would eventually become the Proton rocket. In these days, this was the only real pressure. President Kennedy had been discussing a potential lunar collaboration between the 2 countries, and the race seemed almost like it had reached a peaceful conclusion. However, with Kennedy's assassination in 1963, this proposal disappeared and the race was back on. Korolev focused on the N-1, initially intending to prepare a lunar landing around 3 launches. Later design changes increased the N-1's payload capacity, making it possible to achieve a landing with a single flight. However, before any of these plans could be put into motion, disaster struck. In 1960, at age 53, Korolev's time in the Gulag combined with his workaholic nature began to catch up with him. He suffered a heart attack, and during his recovery, it was discovered that he was also suffering from a kidney disorder. Doctors told him that he needed to take it easy, that if he continued to work as hard as he did, his health was only going to get worse. However, Korolev was one of those people who only really had one gear. He didn't know how to slow down, so he didn't. Believing the Soviet space program would be in danger if they didn't stay ahead of the Americans, he doubled down. Over the next 5 years, Korolev's health problems began to compound. Intestinal bleeding, cardiac arrhythmia, an inflamed gallbladder, fatigue, hearing loss from repeated exposure to rocket test fires, and a bleeding polyp in his large intestine. On January 5, 1966, he entered a hospital in Moscow for what is described as a routine surgery. He would die there at some point, though the exact circumstances are somewhat unknown. The Soviet government stated that a large cancerous tumor had been found in his abdomen, but Valentin Glushko alleged that his surgery had been botched, which caused his death. Other versions of the story stated that he began to bleed during his surgery, and his already poor health prevented doctors from stopping this problem before it was too late. Korolev's family publicly stated that the cancer story is true, and that his weak heart contributed to his death during surgery. It was only now that the Soviet people at large and the rest of the world learned who the mysterious chief designer of the space program was. On the 16th of January, his obituary was published in the Pravda state-run newspaper, featuring a photo of him wearing the many medals he had accumulated in his life, including the Lenin Prize, the Order of Lenin, which he was awarded 3 times, the Order of the Badge of Honor, and the Medal for Labor Valor. There is even a rumor from Khrushchev's son that a Nobel Prize for Korolev was rejected out of concern that it would anger others in the program. A street in Moscow was named after him, a memorial museum was established in his Moscow home that he lived in for the last decade of his life, and even an entire town, Kaliningrad, was renamed Korolev in his honor. RSC Energia, the bureau that was once OKB-1, was renamed to SP Korolev Rocket and Space Corporation Energia. And last but not least, a visual phenomenon of rockets is named after him. When a rocket that uses 4 strap-on boosters performs stage separation, the resulting shape in the sky is referred to as the Korolev Cross. Without the chief designer, the space program suffered significantly, especially the lunar program. Korolev was succeeded by engineer Vasily Mishin, who had been his right-hand man for many years. After attempting to salvage an already flawed N-1 program, Mishin was fired after the rocket's 4 failed test flights, replaced by Valentin Glushko. By then, the space race was long over, and the Soviet lunar program was cancelled. There are those who doubted the Soviets would ever have made the first landing even with Korolev in charge. A rivalry between him and Vladimir Chalomy, who ran the competing Proton-based program, resulted in constant toppling of one another's projects as the two competed for leadership in the program. While they were publicly amicable, they found each other intolerable as they were both headstrong and desired leadership at any cost. Khrushchev's son would state in an interview that Korolev was, quote, not a scientist, not a designer, but a brilliant manager. He saw Korolev's plan with the N1 of simply assembling everything and trying it rather than incremental development to be a massive failing of the lunar program. Others spoke of the authority Korolev held within the program. Alexei Leonov, who performed the first spacewalk on Voskhod 2, stated that he was, quote, extremely demanding. Everyone around him was on tenterhooks, afraid of making a wrong move and invoking his wrath. He was treated like a god. He would also recall that when he first met Korolev, it was so that the engineer could greet the first group of Soviet cosmonauts, whom he referred to as, quote, my little eagles.
We saw a government-class limousine pull up in the courtyard. A man in a dark coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled over his eyes, got out and said, hello, little eagles. Hello, well said together.
Sergei Korolev was, much like other spaceflight pioneers, a very singularly focused man. He rarely drank, living a very disciplined lifestyle that allowed him to put as much focus into his work as possible, sometimes to his detriment. In addition to his health, he had a tendency to seek the company of women by means of convenience. He had an affair with an interpreter in his office in 1948, leading to divorce from his first wife and remarriage to Nina Kotenkova in the next year. Despite this, it is said that Korolev continued to have affairs in his second marriage, though he remained wedded to Kotenkova for the rest of his life. He was also known for deep cynicism, likely inspired by his time in the Gulag. His contemporaries said that one of his favorite expressions was, quote, we are all going to be shot, and there will be no obituary. Korolev's greatest feat may simply be the daunting task of navigating Soviet politics. As difficult as the early world of American spaceflight was, the Soviet version was much more cutthroat, with infighting between bureaus and constantly keeping up with the demands of the authorities. Despite this, Korolev managed to create a vision of Soviet leadership in space, inspiring many students and young engineers to move into his projects and continue his work after him. He lived in unimaginably difficult times, from the fall of the Russian monarchy to becoming a victim of the Red Terror, and at the end of the day, he is the man largely responsible for the space industry existing today. He was the yin to the United States yang, creating the competition that drove the space race, and therefore the rapid innovation of spaceflight technology. Without Korolev, we never tried to shoot for the stars. So, as much as I'm well known to not be a big fan of the Soviet Union itself, I can't say I'm not a fan of this one particularly grumpy Ukrainian rocket engineer. Well done, Sergei. Poyekale.